So Oprah from Sabrina. So thanks for joining us. If you could just leave in the chat where you're dialing in from and who that's living or dead that you would love to have lunch with. Lori would like to have lunch with Queen Elizabeth. I love her. She's fascinating. I love The Crown too. It's a great show. Dorothy, I would love to have lunch with my grandmother one more time too. Carol from Worcester, she's a local lady who'd like to have lunch with Audrey Hepburn, which is a...
Wow, Jesus, that would be really interesting.
Yeah,
all of these folks.
Lovely person, yeah. Gilda Radner was so funny, and Carol Burnett. Good one, Lisa.
Laughing is so important, especially at this challenging time.
Ain't that the truth?
As long as it's not at the expense.
Correct.
Of particular groups of people.
For sure.
Maya Angelou.
Maya Angelou, that one's come up a few times. That's a great one. She's such a smart lady. Jimi Hendrix. Michael's had a couple of choices there. That's a good one. So cool to see where everyone's from. People all over the world joining us today. It's really fascinating. Arkansas.
Very moving to see how many people are mentioning their family. And it never occurred to me with that question to think about my own father.
Yes.
Yeah.
You know, I think about my grandparents a lot.
Passed away, yeah, 30 years ago.
Oh, wow. Bruce Springsteen.
Temple Grandin.
The boss. Raleigh's one of my most favorite places in the country. Mexico. Hi, Christine. Okay, we're going to be getting started in about 2 minutes. Thanks to everyone who's logged in and giving us answers to where they're from and who they'd like to have lunch with, either living or past. We will be getting started in just a minute.
This would be quite a lunch party.
I know. Let's get us all together. Okay, it's 1 o'clock. 1 second, I'm just going to shut off my little reminder. Thanks everyone for joining us. We are going to be shutting the chat off now. And just so you know, we will be recording the session and sending it as a follow-up email to y'all. I just wanted to say good afternoon and thank you so much for joining us. I'm Marlene Saucier. I'm Senior Director of Talent Networks and Partner Success here at TTA. According to a recent client survey by Paradigm, 64% of companies are continuing their diversity efforts while making some shifts to different delivery formats in order to reach all employees, to include both remote and on-site, or as we call them now, essential. By your presence, you do recognize that attending to the reality of diverse employees and customers is as crucial now as it ever was. It's now my pleasure to introduce our training partner and go-to diversity expert, Judy Kaye. Judy has Over 25 years experience designing and delivering workplace training on a variety of diversity-related topics, including creating an inclusive office culture, providing culturally competent patient and customer care, managing unconscious bias, communicating about race and other sensitive topics, and preventing sexual harassment. Judy has worked extensively with private companies, including federal, state, and municipal government agencies, healthcare systems, law enforcement, nonprofit, and faith-based organizations, along with higher education. Prior to entering the diversity field, Judy was a practicing attorney for 10 years. In her personal time, Judy loves to sing, and she's part of 2 multi-faith, multicultural gospel groups in Rhode Island, where she's from. She also has identical twin daughters, which is a fascinating laboratory for seeing the interplay of nature versus nurture. I love that. So as I mentioned earlier, we are shutting the chat off. Please feel free to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to send Judy your questions at any point during the presentation. And she'll reserve about 15 minutes at the end of the session to answer them for you guys. Meanwhile, as I mentioned, the public chat function will be closed. If you have any technical issues, you can reach out to the panelists along with myself. So please do consider doing that. So Judy, please do take it from here. Thank you.
Thanks, Marlene. Hello, everybody. I did notice that a couple of folks pressed the raise hand function just before we close the public chat. So I hope if you do have a question that you'll put it in the Q&A box, or if you have any technical issues that you'll let our tech team know. And there will be times during the session where I may ask for a raise of hands just to get an idea of some of the responses in the room. So if you don't know where that is, on my screen, if you go to participants at the bottom and click on it, there should be a raise hand icon, or you might have one that's separate. So for those of you that like to see agendas, there we go. You know, the terminology around diversity is always changing and evolving, as are the principles. So some of you may be working in offices that are called diversity, equity, and inclusion, or inclusion and diversity, or affirmative action. So I'm just going to use diversity for simplicity today, but it embraces all those things. And we'll just review, make sure we're all on the same page about what we're talking about, at least for purposes of this webinar today, because how we define it often depends on what our goals are in our organization. And we're going to do a quick review of the business case and actually give you a chance to reflect on your own business case. So let's practice using the hand raising right now. I'm curious to know how many people who are on the call right now have a actually articulated business case for your diversity initiatives, and including you know, whether or not you have found that it's been an effective way to get, you know, buy-in from your senior leadership. We have a few people who are raising their hands. It's going up, 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 up. Okay, that's good. Because it's not, as many of you know, it's not just important in terms of getting buy-in from your senior leaders, but it also really helps you focus on what your goals actually are and where the needle is that you actually want to move. Because very often people, I'll ask another hand-raising question here. How many have had the experience of being on a diversity committee or a diversity council that had a lot of really great, energetic people on it with a lot of ideas, but they actually never accomplished anything? Like, I wrote reports that got shelved, or they came up with lots of ideas that were never implemented. So the clearer we are, and a lot of people are raising their hands now, so the clearer we are about what our organizational or business goals are, the more likely we are to be able to reach them. And even in ordinary times, not all instructor-led diversity training is effective, as many of you have probably learned from experience. So we'll do a quick review of what I think at least are some of the elements that make for effective diversity training, and then we'll get a chance to look at why some of them might even work well, if not better, in a virtual environment, much to many of our surprise. So in talking about what diversity is, and you'll notice that I don't actually read the slides. I am assuming that you can read them, and if there's anybody who has who needs them to be read, please do let the tech team know, or and we'll do that. I tend to start broad. A lot of people with their diversity definitions start with the legally regulated protected groups like race and gender and religion and disability. And then as they do their diversity initiative, it grows, and they may even get pressure from people in their organization to broaden it to include work style and departments and personality and other things. And I think that's really important because diversity does embrace any human difference that makes us who we are, and any of those can impact our interactions at work. And at the same time, I find that defining diversity by that long laundry list sometimes allows people to avoid dimensions of diversity that are more challenging and sensitive to talk about, like race and gender and national origin. So curious again with the hand raise, anybody had that experience that even though you want to be very inclusive in your definition, you find that it also sometimes allows people to stay too much in their comfort zone? So that's why I start broad. Yep, more hands are being raised. That's why I like to start broad and then begin to hone in. Sometimes we get a sense that, oh, just diversity is wonderful, which it is, and it does increase productivity and performance and creativity. But the reason that it's so challenging is because we're human beings, and diversity can generate both delight and curiosity in human beings, but it can also generate fear, anxiety, suspicion, avoidance, us-them dynamics at the same time that it can bring us richer ideas and collaboration. And I think when we talk about diversity, we don't talk enough about the challenges involved, probably because we think people then might be scared off from doing something about it. But then we need to remind them that whether we're doing anything about diversity or not, it's always there, it's always operating. These dynamics are always happening underneath the surface, and so we might as well be open and intentional about them and be sure that we are harnessing them for the good of the organization and whatever our own values are. Unconscious bias and racism and sexism and all those isms are real. You're seeing more trainings around unconscious bias. We can certainly do that training for you. And we're starting to understand that having bias doesn't make us bad people. At the same time, it's becoming clearer and clearer, and this pandemic is helping us see that good intentions alone aren't enough to actually eradicate the stereotypes and bias or the impact of our prejudices. They're there, they're in our own hearts and minds, they're in our organizations, our companies, our governments, our social structures. And so we have to take that into account in talking about diversity. And then we get narrower as the society sees that some of the dimensions of identity have been associated with long-standing patterns of injustice or oppression. Then we have laws to try to regulate them, and that's where we start identifying the protected classes like race, national origin, sex, and religion, all of which date back to the 1960s, to prohibit discrimination. And we all know that the laws are necessary and not sufficient to get us where we need to go. And our understanding and approach to diversity is always evolving. I mean, I know when I got in the field, 25 years ago, there was a lot of attention being paid to lesbian and gay folks in the workplace, and nobody was talking about gender variance or transgender folks. In the 1990s, the Americans with Disability Act was pretty new. And so lots of discussion about what reasonable accommodation meant, what a disability was, how to be more inclusive. After 9/11, many of us who thought that we were very interfaith oriented realized that we didn't know anything about Islam, and maybe we didn't know any people who were actually Muslim. So again, there was sort of an awakening and an extension of our awareness of diversity to become more educated, to build relationships with more people who are different than us. And even to today, we find that new categories or new ways of being human are coming to the fore. So where a few years ago, we might have been talking about folks on the autism spectrum or Asperger's, now some of them are starting to say, hey, this actually isn't a disability or a pathology, it's another aspect of diversity. It's neurodiversity, and we need to be approaching it in a different way. So it's always evolving. How many of you would be surprised to find out? Of course, sexual harassment has been recognized since the 1980s. Sexual orientation and gender identity are now protected in many states, but raise your hand if you're surprised to learn that sexual orientation and gender identity are not yet protected by federal law. It's not yet the law in the land in all of the United States that LGBTQ folks are protected from discrimination in employment. So some people didn't realize that. And again, I think it's important that, and especially depending on what jurisdiction you're in, depending on what country you're in, some of these issues are, are going to be more charged or more challenging. And then, of course, there's the everyday workforce differences that sometimes get put at the end of that laundry list, the differences in our own organization by department, by level of management, by work style, personality, and they may not be legally regulated, but actually all the same dynamics of diversity apply, which is that we're going to tend to congregate with people who are similar to us. We're going to tend to sometimes be drawn to people who are different, but very often actually tend to distance ourselves from people who are different. We're going to project assumptions and stereotypes onto the people in sales or in engineering or in HR or in the central office. And so a lot of those dynamics we can be just as intentional about, even if they don't fall within sort of diversity, traditional diversity parameters. So you might be curious, so what is this white middle-aged Jewish woman, doing here, sitting, talking to you about diversity? So I thought I'd just share a little bit of my own journey around this. So when I was very young, I was the only Jewish student in my school. I lived in a small suburb that was quasi-rural. And when I was about 8 years old, we then moved to another suburb where I was no longer in a minority. At the same time, I started hearing about white people who lived on the other side of the tracks, right? That some parts of town were considered more desirable than other parts of town. And then as I got into adolescence and I started learning more about the Holocaust, the fact that I was Jewish was clearly not just a source of identity and celebration and ethics and deep wisdom, but it also had been a source of persecution and genocide for hundreds of years. And so that was really eye-opening and aroused in me a concern about other groups who might have experienced the same thing. And lo and behold, in the 1970s, when I was in high school, there was a lot of protest and violence in the Boston area around school desegregation. And so issues of racism and white supremacy and people talking about, well, this is really about local control and not about race. I started thinking more about those kinds of issues. And then in college in the 1970s, I arrived just in time for second wave feminism, which explained why it was that I didn't always fit in as a girl, why it was I wasn't considered good looking according to gender norms at the time. And so that shaped my life in major ways. And I, along with a lot of Black and Latino folks at that time, benefited from affirmative action efforts because the society in general was saying, hey, wait a minute, we have all this talent out there, but it's not represented in our professional schools. It's not represented in leadership roles. So those doors became more open, and I and a lot of other people went to law school who hadn't had access to that before. And when I was a lawyer, I was working in a community with a lot of immigrants and refugees. And so again, was continuing to just understand how rich and complex people were, but also how many dynamics and assumptions and biases and ignorance and inequities were out there. So, I could tell you my whole life story. Suffice it to say, as an adult, one of my sisters married an African-American man, Jerome, so I now have a niece who identifies as Jewish and Black. And I had the honor of officiating at her bat mitzvah, at her coming of age ceremony. And so, I get much more closely to see what life is like living in their skin, even though I'll never actually know what it's like. So I realized that diversity was really my passion. And so I eventually left law and decided that I wanted to do more facilitation and education than litigation around these issues. There might be other dimensions of diversity that you're thinking of in your workplace. It might be politics in this year of electoral change. So I want you to think for a second, we're going to do a poll, and I'm going to ask you to check off which dimensions of diversity are most on your radar screen in your organization at this moment. Whether it's because of the pandemic, whether it's because you've had a merger, whether it's because of your own organizational growth, you can check off as many that apply. And I'll give you 30 seconds or so to answer the poll, and then we'll take a look at the results. And just get a sense of who's in the room. Great. So we have about a third of the people answering, so I'll give you a few more seconds. We're up to about half. We'll give you 10 more seconds. 10, 9, 8, 7, and if anybody wants to sing the Jeopardy jingle, right, the game show. Do, 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 do. Okay, we're up to 67. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'm going to end the poll and let's look at the results. So we have 69% of folks who are on the call today saying that race and/or ethnicity, nationality, language, and culture are things that are high on their radar screen. And I think that's great to hear. So much work still left to do in those areas and so much opportunity. Next biggest category, it looks like, are age and generations, which also makes a lot of sense. A lot of people said organizational differences do matter, and they do. That looks like that's the third most popular, and then sex, gender identity, and sexual orientation, and sorry for that typo, which we all missed, and then going down from there, ability, socioeconomic status, religion, and other. Great. So what's important, of course, is to whatever effort we're doing around diversity training or diversity transformation, to focus on those differences that actually matter and having the greatest impact in our organization. We can't talk about this without being clear, putting on the table what the current reality is. So it is a time of unprecedented upheaval, and this brings out the best and the worst in people. On the one hand, it brings people together and people reach out across difference to help each other with expressions of caring and support. At the same time, we know that the way bias works in our brains and in our nervous system, that any kind of stress or threat will exacerbate that tendency. And when we're scared, when we're threatened in some way, our ability to think in nuance and our ability to differentiate people really kind of goes on pause, and our fight or flight response is motivated, so that we tend to see things in much more binary terms: good, bad, friend, foe, safe, unsafe. And so if anything, during this time, managing that impulse is more important than ever, because if not attended to, not only could it endanger people's safety because people do panic buying, or people become threatened at the idea that they should wear a mask, but it can lead to all other kinds of unconscious biases being released into the world. So you may already be thinking about this. I've had a number of musings. These are just my initial ideas. Wondering, as life changes, how this is going to intersect with our diversity training and our diversity initiatives. So the impact of wearing masks. I don't know if any of you have noticed, but often I can't identify a person. I don't know who they are. So on the one hand, it's unnerving. On the other hand, I kind of like it because it requires people to interact with each other. And it makes it a little bit harder for me to pigeonhole somebody's race, age, gender, gender identity. And raise your hand if you've had that similar experience, where there's something about wearing the masks that's kind of leveling the field in a way, and yet at the very same time, because we know that everybody's experience is different and we're not going through this the same way, I can imagine that there are some people of color who worry that wearing a mask is going to exacerbate the fact that some people think that they're threatening or suspicious or stealing or shouldn't be trusted, because that's the reality of our world. So thinking about it from all different points of view, there's no one way in which the pandemic intersects with diversity. It is going to be very multifaceted. Obviously, it's surfacing a lot of race and class inequities, who are the groups that are most getting sickest, who are in the highest contact jobs, who are most likely not to have paid sick leave. A lot of those differences and inequities line up. They're people of color, they're poorer people, often they're women. And again, because of the threat and the way our bias reaction works, we're seeing and hearing about scapegoating of Asian folks, Asian Americans. I'm waiting to hear more scapegoating of Jews, as you know, throughout the millennia, when there were plagues in the past, it was very often blamed on Jews. Immigrant communities, sometimes breakouts are in processing plants where there's a lot of immigrant communities. So these are all things that become ever more critical to be able to handle effectively. Work family pressures. You know, there are lots of men in today's world that take parental leave and that are co-equal partners in household duties and child rearing. And my guess is there are a lot more men now who are experiencing working from their home and juggling taking care of young children and taking care of and having to oversee their schooling. Would love to see a hand raise if you want to do it now, as to anybody else who's noticed this change in gender roles or the different dynamics that are occurring. And you know, time will tell whether this awakens us to take a fresh look in our organizations at some of our benefit policies, whether we actually walk the talk, even though we may have policies that say we encourage men to take parental leave and to work part-time or take advantage of flex time. In a lot of organizations, it's much more likely to be the women that do that. And now that more people are having that experience, you know, will it actually lead to more organizations saying, hey, this really does make sense, and maybe we shouldn't penalize men, or shouldn't penalize anybody who's choosing to also be active with their family and not consider them, you know, less ambitious, less capable, whatever. Sexual harassment. You know, you don't have to physically avoid that creepy employee or boss if you're not physically in the office. A lot of people don't have that luxury, and so again, restaurants that are operating, or nursing homes, or other high contact places, sexual harassment may be continuing unabated, and we still need to be paying attention to it. And for those of us who are working at home, I'd like to hear how that issue might be morphing at all, and are some of those power dynamics showing up in other ways. Access for people with disabilities. I've been reading a lot lately that some folks with disabilities are saying, hey, you know, we've been working from home and using technology and all kinds of creative ways of virtual work and participation for a very, very long time. You can learn from us. You can learn from us, you know, listen to us, let us share some ideas. At the very same time, again, there may be disabilities that are visible or invisible that are being exacerbated now because of the pandemic. And so as we are retooling our policies and our everyday practice, we always want to be saying, how is this working for different groups of people? And even if we identify a group, whether it's folks with disabilities or women or older or younger folks, to realize that there's going to be diversity within that diversity, and they aren't all going to be dealing with it the same way. So the broader we can see those differences, the more effective we're going to be at raising up the level of everybody's participation. Communication, you know, important now more than ever. We're using more virtual platforms. You get to see some body language more with a video. You get to see some less. You get some anonymity. Phones and computer lines sometimes make it harder to understand people's accents. Some people have been working globally all along. Some people are now really having that experience for the first time of interacting across cultures. So again, brings in all the same dynamics about assumptions, stereotyping, the importance of being skillful and aware of how we interact with people. And lastly, really the business core of what's going on. We're going to be seeing, and we already are seeing, new products and industries arising because of the pandemic. So there's a huge opportunity. We all know, or many of us know, that the research establishes that diverse teams are more innovative, more creative, and so this, the more central a part of our organizational consciousness is, the better our organizations are going to emerge from this current period and emerge hopefully stronger and more intact. So if you have any other questions about this or comments that you want to turn into a question, I just want to remind you to use the Q&A function. And I'll just take just a quick poll here. We'll put up the next one to just say yes, no, or you don't know whether or not what's going on right now has impacted your awareness or your thoughts, or maybe your planning regarding diversity. Or are you feeling a lot of pressure like, oh, now the diversity has to take the back burner. We don't have money for this. We don't have bandwidth for this. You know, what are you finding? What are people around you saying? Yeah, so we've got about a third of the people responding. So we see a lot of people saying yes, but almost an equal number of people saying no or not sure. I'll close the poll in 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And there you have the results. So it doesn't quit, so it's more than half that say, yes, you're realizing how diversity is implicated or is operating now more than ever, but almost as many people are saying no or they're not sure. So hopefully by the end of the webinar, we'll have a much higher percentage of yeses, and it'd be fun if we were able to pull in that poll at the end again. I don't know if that would be possible. So what is your, I'm going to stop sharing the results. Hold on, close this. Good, let's keep going. So what is your business case? You're not going to check off on this particular slide. We will have a poll after this. But as I said before, you know, the business case isn't just because we have to, you know, justify our budget, or it isn't only so that people in our company don't think this is just about political correctness. That being really clear about where we're going with our diversity initiatives and with our diversity training makes it much more likely that we'll get there. I was doing some consulting for a diversity committee at a university, and they had come up with just dozens of terrific recommendations over the years, none of which had ever been implemented. And when they finally got to identifying what their primary goals were, and it had to do with women and students of color falling out of the science tracks in the freshman and sophomore year and a lot of the entry-level courses, they realized that that was a focus, that was someplace where they could really move the needle if they focused on that. And when they focused on that, they realized that they needed other people at the table and who weren't on the committee, so they had to bring those folks in. And they also realized that the issue of the quality of the entry-level courses was something that transcended diversity issues, that there was a concern across the university with how well those courses were being run, whether they had been updated since 30 years ago. So by being clear about what their goal was, that they wanted to increase the success rate of people who they knew were every bit as smart and capable as the majority students, but something was happening that was dropping them out in the process. By being really clear about that goal, they were able to marshal the resources and the attention to do something about it. So here's a set of possible business drivers that you've probably heard about, been thinking about, and take a moment to think which ones are strongest in your case. Which ones are you relying on to support diversity initiatives in your company? Or which ones are you finding your senior leadership is most impacted by, or that move you the most? So let's look at the next poll, and you'll have a chance to again, choose as many as you like, and be sure you scroll down in the poll because there might be answers that aren't immediately visible to you. So take a couple of moments, and which ones are highest, which ones are most compelling for you and your company? People are answering a little bit more slowly. That's a good thing, because I think this one takes thought. And maybe you might think, even if you want to check them all off, maybe challenge yourself to just pick the top 2 or 3. I think you probably can uncheck some boxes if you want. Maybe force yourself to hone in on the top 2 or 3, because that may tell you something about what's going on right now and what direction you want to go in. Okay, we'll give it another 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And for the 70 or 80 folks of you who haven't answered yet, feel free to jot down your answer somewhere else so that you remember it. And here are the results. So the highest vote earners are around getting and keeping talent and promoting the work culture for that talent. And exciting to see that people are still realizing that as diverse as we've become, we still have a long way to go in making sure that all different corners of our organizations and our management and our leadership reflect those broad pools and populations, and that maintaining an inclusive work culture is something that requires constant attention. A good number of people recognizing the innovation and the customer service angle of it. For many of us, the fact that it's the right thing to do, that it's our personal values, our company values, yes, does hold a lot of sway. Very few people, only 3 people saying they're not sure. So, and a good solid third who still see this primarily from a compliance angle, or maybe their companies are pushing them to see it from a compliance angle. And so if you find that that's where they're coming from, or that's what's taking up a lot of your attention, that might be an opportunity to try to shift the dialogue around diversity training to maybe address some of the other benefits that your company may or may not be thinking of from a business perspective. So you've got everybody on board. Diversity training is going to happen. Whether it's done by a live instructor or done in a video course, they're not all the same, right? And they're not all equally effective. So I thought it'd be helpful to just kind of remind ourselves what some of the things are that we want to be looking for, so that in thinking about the virtual platform, we'll make sure that those quality indicators, those metrics are still there, and we're using them to our advantage. So we've already talked a fair amount about the business goals, but the long-term strategy is also important, right? Again, a lot of learning and development people on this call who know quite well that even the best training in the world, and I think TTA's trainings are among the best in the world, even the best training isn't going to change behaviors necessarily, isn't necessarily going to change hiring practices, that it requires an ongoing business strategy and other practices and policies that are going to reinforce and extend the learning, and that there have to be metrics and accountability. So having your training from the get-go tied in with that, perhaps having it reinforced through performance evaluation, those are the things that are ultimately going to make the training most beneficial. So this is my philosophy of diversity training. You know, I've attended a lot as a learner. I've seen a lot of the canned trainings that are out there, and many of them have a lot of good information in them. But to my mind, unless it gives participants an opportunity to really reflect and think critically about their own identity and experiences of exclusion and inclusion, to acknowledge their own vulnerability, their own places of ignorance, their own anxiety about saying the wrong thing, putting things out on the table, their fear of offending, their resentment or resistance to being placed in a diversity training because they don't see how it connects to their job, or their business outcome. So in my experience, having an opportunity in a training to create safety for people to do that exploration makes the learning a lot more effective. And also fosters a more nuanced understanding when you do get to the knowledge pieces. I mean, far too often I see in both live and canned diversity training that generalizations about women, about Mexicans, about different generations, about whatever category of worker you're talking about, are often oversimplified or caricatured or really stereotyped. They might end up reinforcing stereotypes rather than debunking them, rather than giving people a more complex awareness of both our similarities and our differences. I can give an example just from my singing experience. Marlene mentioned that I love to sing. In addition to the gospel groups I'm in, I also sing in a sacred harp group. So even though I'm Jewish, I sing in these two media that are really Christian sacred music, because I love the music so much, and there's a lot that's very universal about the spirituality. The cultures could not be more different. So in the gospel group, it's much more racially and ethnically mixed. And there's a higher proportion of people in the groups that are there, of people who are very emotionally demonstrative. We hug and we kiss each other. We use our hands. We make a lot of noise when we're talking. And I'm extremely comfortable in that environment. When I go to my sacred harp singing, it's almost exclusively white folks. A large proportion of them, I would guess, are introverted. Many of them are in occupations that I think tend, in general, without stereotyping, to attract introverted folks. They're in tech jobs, they're scholars, they're farmers, they're working by themselves, and it's a very different feel. Still human beings, but I can't read them as well. It took me a long time. For a while, I thought they didn't like me because I wasn't getting people coming up to me and gushing or hugging me or saying, "Hi, how are you?" They were more reserved. And when we started singing, there was tremendous energy, and that was the universal connection. But as soon as the singing stopped, it was quiet. And so I just say that to acknowledge that diversity training needs to recognize that we are different. We have differences between groups. In general, there are tendencies. I'm going to have more in common with someone who has a communication style, someone who might be Caribbean or someone who's Italian, than I am with somebody more likely to have something in common communication style-wise than someone who is Japanese or Scandinavian or Native American. And at the same time, within all those groups, to constantly remind ourselves that there are different personalities and that we can't overgeneralize in any of those groups. And often there's other factors at play. But I think quality diversity training gives people a chance to really get into the weeds about some of those things, as opposed to dealing with them on a surface level and saying, you know, let's not stereotype, since we can't avoid that anyway as human beings. And lastly, that the quality training is skills oriented, right? It's practical. It's not just, of course, we all have good intentions and you would never discriminate or harass somebody on purpose. And of course, you would speak up if somebody said something biased at the workplace. But the fact is, when we find ourselves in that situation, we very often freeze. Let me see a quick hand raise of those of you who are aware that in the workplace, sometimes things get said and done that are not diversity friendly, that are exclusive, are offensive, are sometimes harmful, and people don't say anything. Or people say something and they make it worse. Or they don't know what their options are. Or they don't have the personal skills, even though they may be good communicators in another setting. They're too anxious because it's about a sensitive topic like sex or race or a difference in education or status in the organization. They don't realize that they can use a lot of the same personal and communication skills that they use in other contexts. So good diversity training for me is going to connect diversity skills with our other management skills, soft skills, sales skills, customer service skills, and give people actually an opportunity to practice them. And this is where diversity training can actually be better, I think, than in-person training, because the in this call we have 269 people. If this were an actual diversity training and not just a training about doing virtual diversity training, we would be able to take some time and do some honest self-examination and self-disclosure about some of our own experiences of bias. And we might be able to do it anonymously. We could pick an avatar, we could use just our first name, and we might find that we're more willing to share some of those things and be candid about them than we would if we were in a room where we could see other people that we worked with. The questions and comments and case scenarios that we come up with might be more likely to be more honest, more, people might be less afraid that they're going to look stupid or insensitive or show their ignorance or offend somebody. In using a virtual platform, you can use sticky notes, you can use the chat, you can use Q&A, you can use whiteboards. There are all kinds of ways that you can get people interactive. You can easily and quickly break people down into small groups and say, right now I can say, okay, we're going to divide up into 50 groups of 4 people or 5 people, and you're now going to have 5 minutes to talk about when was the first time you noticed your gender. Or when was the first time you saw a person with a visible disability, and how did your parents respond when you asked them about it? And then in 2 minutes, we could all come back and talk about that and apply some of those learnings to things that are happening today. Not as easy to do that in a big room where you all have to find different places to stand. I could use help from the tech team right now, because the fourth, if I can get the pictures up, I just figured it out myself. So there you go. Good to know, and good to be able to model. Part, I think, of being a diversity trainer is being very open about awkwardness and not knowing something, because that's often what's getting in the way with people in doing diversity training. So tools for engagement and interactivity, I actually already mentioned. Focusing on groups most relevant to your workplace or industry. So TTA, we can put together for you any kind of consulting or training program that is customized to your industry, to your organizational culture. And in the middle of the training, it may turn out that a particular training group wants to talk about a different dimension of diversity. Now, in a real life diversity training, you can often pivot and address those issues, all the more so in a virtual setting, simply because then you can jump on the internet and grab information about a particular group. Somebody asked me the other day, is there data on, what was the question? I think it was something, it might have been about stereotypes about who are bad drivers, women or Asian people. I worked in a town where the police believed that Asian people made worse drivers. And I could go on the internet and pull up a study that said that that was completely false, right? And we're in an age right now where being able to debunk false information and be able to provide accurate information about what's going on and about each other's experiences is really important. Sessions can build on each other. When you're doing a diversity training in person, it often doesn't make sense to do it for less than 2 or 3 hours, because you want people to build rapport and get to know each other, and there's a lot to cover. But in a virtual setting, you can do an hour, 90-minute session, and then do part 2 a week from now, and part 3 a month from now, and a follow-up session 3 months from now, and give people homework, let people practice the skills in between. Between now and the next time, have lunch with somebody in your office who you have never started a conversation with. Go to that person who calls somebody else sweetie or honey or mispronounces their name, and give them some feedback, and practice giving them feedback in a respectful way, and come back and let us know how it went. Or ask one of your direct reports who's different from you by gender or age or ethnic background. Ask for feedback about how you're doing as a manager, and come back and talk about what you learned from it. So those kinds of things, I think, can happen in some ways more easily with a virtual platform and with more diversity across the country and across the world. You can gain instant access to things like the implicit bias test. Raise your hand if you have taken one or more of the implicit bias tests. You can, if you haven't, you can Google it. They take only about 10 minutes each. There are several varieties of them available to everybody publicly for free, and they can be very eye-opening. You know, even though I identify as a feminist my entire adult life, I still have been conditioned by the same society that everybody else has, and I was a little dismayed to see that in the implicit bias test, I did a little bit more automatically associate men with professional titles and career-oriented words than I did women. And I've had friends of color tell me that they were surprised to see that they didn't necessarily have as strong a bias sort of against racism, as you might say, as you might expect, as they expected to have, because they have been steeped in the same society and have been receiving the same messages, the same anti-Black messages that white people have for many years. So in a virtual training, you can have people take the implicit bias test right then and there during the training and take it anonymously and share results, or they can take it and come back to round 2. You can use it in a lot of different ways. And last but not least, as many of you know, having the support and active endorsement and modeling and engagement of senior leadership is always critical to a diversity training initiative and the success of really any company's diversity efforts at all. And with a virtual platform, you can have your senior leaders present at every single session, whether it's a videoed message that they deliver, whether it's a statement that they released, whether it's case studies or stories that they're submitting to us as the trainers that we're then able to share in an ongoing way, which also gives the senior leaders an opportunity to be walking the talk in between the trainings and be applying what everybody else is learning. So I think there are a lot of benefits in the virtual platform of engaging senior leaders, even if they're not always there, and of conveying the conveying that endorsement, conveying that authority and that business case to people who are in the training. Here's just a very short list of some of the topics that we would be more than delighted to provide training or consulting around. There's an infinite variety of these. Some of them are more general, some of them are more specific. I recently had a client ask me to do a training focused solely on employee, how to effectively support an employee who was transitioning gender on the job. And that was important enough that they wanted employees to be prepared, they wanted managers to feel comfortable, they wanted that employee to have agency in the process. Whereas, for another organization, it might be that you simply want your managers to be clear about your business case. In another setting, it might be that you've been hearing talk about microaggressions and micro affirmations, and you're not really sure what people are talking about and why they're such a big deal. And so maybe you'd like a session that focuses on that. And then you can come back and say, all right, now let's talk about some of the intervention techniques. When you hear something, how can you prevent some of these? What is a micro affirmation and how can you incorporate that into good management skills so that you're likely to minimize the chance of offensive or harmful conduct taking place. So take a moment and think about some of these topics before we get to the questions. We'll have one more poll. Are there any of these topics that particularly resonate with you that you'd like to see happen? Would you like to reach out to TTA and ask for some support in perhaps pursuing, if not a training, even just a couple of hours of consulting to talk about what might best support your organization or industry at this time in this virtual setting to best reach your goals, both in terms of values and terms of results in terms of productivity. And we've got about a quarter of the people responding. So I'll give you a few more seconds. We'll see the results and then we'll go to your questions. And I see some hand raising. So if you're raising your hand because you have a question, please do type the question into the Q&A box so that we can see it and I can attempt to address it. And if it's a tech issue, to please let our tech team know. Okay, 5 more seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The poll is now closed and there are the results. So you can sort of see for yourself where you and your peers, at least right now, have the strongest interest.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, a very, very robust response.
That's for sure.
And none of these things lend themselves to a one-fits-all training or to a one point in time learning process. But all of these are things that can be incorporated into the ongoing organizational development and business development of your company. So now let's hear what you're thinking.
Okay, I'm going to start with Eleanor. Eleanor had a great question. How can we foster the safe space necessary for staff to be open, reflective, and their genuine, authentic selves?
So building relationships is the first thing that comes to my mind. You know, do people have opportunities to get to know each other? Not necessarily, they don't have to know each other's deepest, darkest secrets, but are there opportunities for people not just to socialize at a bar, because that may also exclude a lot of people, you know, not just to attend things in large groups, but do people have an opportunity in smaller groups to do icebreakers, to find out where their names come from, to find out what some of their experiences around diversity have been? Are the managers and the leaders modeling that and talking about that? Some companies do initiatives where they profile employees and they do art shows or banners that introduce, that kind of give a personal profile of employees from all different levels of management and frontline workers, saying something about them, people from all walks of life, things that you might not think from looking at them. And that opens up those conversations. I think it ties into everything you're doing that makes your employees feel comfortable to give you negative feedback about their experience as employees, how they're being managed, what the workload is. All of this is connected. If it's a place where people feel like they can be authentic and they can come to a manager or come to you and say, something isn't working for me, I'm uncomfortable, how can we make this better? Then that's going to inure to your benefit around diversity issues as well. So I'll stop there for now, and we can have more conversation afterwards if you want. Marlene, you have another question?
I do. Tyra would like to know if every company should have a diversity plan. She says her company does not have one.
Yes. So yes, of course, in the same way that every company should have a plan, period. And diversity should always be part of the plan. So often people have a separate diversity plan. Ideally, to me, diversity is part of whatever plan the company already has. So presumably they have a business plan, or they have a marketing plan, or they have a strategic plan. And sometimes a place to start is to see if there are some leverage points there. Is it in the focus on customers that they have? Is it that there's something in the plan about reaching new markets? You know, if it's a bank and the bank down the street is now has an interpreter who speaks a language of a new immigrant population in town, they're going to get all that business. And so it might be that rather than talking about it as a diversity plan, you go to the bank leadership and you say, I see an opportunity for us to open another branch and bring in a lot of business. If you have already a diversity plan, certainly you can strengthen it. And so that's how I'd answer that question. Yes.
That's great. Nicola and Kathleen both had some questions relative to the terms microaffirmations and microaggressions, and they were hoping you might be able to go a little bit deeper on those and maybe provide some examples.
Examples, sure. So the wonderful thing about this world now is that anytime you hear a term that you don't understand like this, just Google it. And you will get a terrific answer and you'll get examples. So microaggressions are those very small and subtle, seemingly not very damaging comments or actions that people may say or do towards people who are different, often without malicious intent, which by themselves might not seem particularly harmful, but tend to happen over and over and over again if you're in that group, and the cumulative effect of them can be very destructive. So, for example, there are Jews of color, right? There are lots of Jewish people who are dark-skinned, who are Asian, who are Latino, who are Black. And sometimes when a Black person walks into a synagogue, somebody might say, "Oh, what are you doing here?" Right? Instead of assuming that they're there either because they're Jewish or because they want to attend a Jewish service. So anything that's in the category of what are you? Or, you know, is that a man or a woman? Or, you know, anything that almost in some ways even seems to be coming from genuine curiosity, but when you think about it, it is reflecting the fact that somebody is ignorant or insensitive or lacks exposure. You know, just simply doesn't know. And by talking about them and bringing them to light, you can often raise people's consciousness. You know, a microaffirmation is almost like an intentional reversal of that. It's doing something that is going to preclude a microaggression. So it's, for example, making sure that you always give credit to people who have given you good ideas, because there's a tendency in meetings for men to get credit for ideas that women have just voiced, right? So a microaffirmation would just be to be conscious, whether you're male or female or identify of another gender, to be conscious that whenever anybody contributes, that you raise it up, that you point it out, so that people see exemplars, people see that people of all types and backgrounds are doing good work, that you are welcoming to everybody, just that you say hello to everybody. I'll give you an example. When there was a recent eclipse, I was on a college campus, and it looked like I made an assumption that a group of people were professors based on how they were dressed and where they were and what was going on. And two of them were Black, and as they walked by me, I had a question, and I said, "By any chance is one of you a scientist?" Because some of them were liberal arts professors, some of them were administration. And one of the professors said to me, smiled and said, "No, I'm not, but the world's a better place because you asked." So that's an example. You know, 20 years ago, I probably wouldn't have thought to ask that question. And I might have been the one who thought that that person was more likely to be the hired help. Or when I walked into a store, someone might assume that it's my husband who's buying the car. But through training and through learning, now a good salesperson is going to be aware of bias and is going to, when they see a couple come in, are going to talk to them equally and equitably and see who the people are before them and what it is that they need and who in this particular household is making the decision. And do more research.
I have one more quick question. Where is the best place to look for activity ideas or icebreakers to tap into different senses and moods for a diverse program of middle-level leaders?
Yeah, to me, the harder question is, how do you know when to stop looking? There is so much stuff out there. The first thing I'd say is come to TTA, because, you know, we can help you design your trainings or your programs, as I said, even if it's just on a consulting basis and you're fully equipped to do the training, but you just want some enhancements, we can help you with that. But there's so many sources. I mean, the Society for Human Resource Management, there are educational resources, there are anti-racism, there are companies that produce curricula around this. If you Google unconscious bias education, if you Google diversity icebreakers, you will get more than enough information. If you're in the healthcare field, the Office of Minority Health, licensing organizations, the whole field of culturally competent patient care has, there's, activities and exercises in every different industry. So, dip your toe in it. There's videos you can use to start conversations. There's the implicit bias test. So sorry, I can't just give you one simple answer. We just have a surfeit of richness and supply of those things now, which is really a great thing.
That's awesome. Well, we are at the top of the hour. Thank you so much, Judy, for spending your time with us and explaining, this has been incredible. I really, really appreciate it. Our company does, and we really value your partnership with us. And thanks to all of you for joining us. Hopefully it's been an informative hour for you. And thank you so much. We hope you have a wonderful week.
Marlene, I don't know if it's possible, but if there are questions we didn't get to, maybe we can type up an answer and send it out to the participant list.
We do have a couple more, so we'll be
Great.
Sure to do that. Thank you very much.
So I hope to be able to answer all of your questions and engage with you in the future. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.